And we are live. Hello, and welcome to the Undisputed MMA show presented by the FTN Network. My name is Jonah Shiffman. I am joined, as I am every week here on the show, by John Kelly. We're going to be going over UFC Vegas 47 going down this weekend. We got a main event between Sean Strickland and Jack Hermansson coming up alongside, I believe, 13 fights as of Thursday night. So, card, a good one to look forward to, John. We didn't have any UFC last week after UFC 270 event 2 weeks ago, but I believe we've got like 7 or 8 straight weeks of cards coming up after this one. So we're back on the saddle. I feel like we got a little taste of UFC in 2022, but now like the grinding gets real. So excited to kind of embark on this journey with you, my friend. How are you doing headed into this fight week?
Yeah, doing good, man. Feel good about this card. Couple low level stuff, but I think we're going to see a lot of finishes here. So I think it's going to be a fun little card. I'm excited. It'll get us tuned up for the pay-per-view next week.
Exactly. Pay-per-view next week. Of course, Israel Adesanya and Robert Whitaker will fight again. But until we talk about those fights, we do have 13 to break down this week. John, it's part of the reason that you might be excited for this card because your boy Malcolm Gordon is not only fighting on the
Oh,
card,
buddy.
he's the first fight on the card. So after 13 days with no UFC fights in our lives, we come back and we see Malcolm X Gordon plus 225, 7.1 thousand dollars on DraftKings. He's obviously the underdog in this fight as he finds himself in most fights at the UFC level. He takes on UFC newcomer Dennis Bondar, who's minus 280, $9.1 thousand on DraftKings is Bondar. And John, I won't steal any of your thunder, my man. I believe you are 3 for 3 in calling Malcolm Gordon fights, including a big underdog cash against Francisco Figueiredo in his last time out. My question to you is simple. Are we riding the Malcolm Gordon train once again, or was it nice to get a little bit of cash out of it and then hop off the train before it heads off the tracks here?
Yeah, so you hit on the big thing. The rumor is that I'm the Malcolm Gordon whisperer. Every UFC fight that he's had, we've made money on. Obviously fading him twice and then getting on the train against the fake Figueiredo his last time out at a big number. So I feel like I have a really strong read on Malcolm Gordon, and honestly, I just love the fact that the books are not like respecting how fragile he is. Like, he's been finishing all of his losses. He's been hurt to the body. He's a black belt, but he's been submitted. Amir Albazi cut through him on the mat. But he just gets hurt too much. He's been knocked out 4 times. I think every one of them was in the first round. And now he's facing a guy in Dennis Bondar who, yes, it's low level, but he at least is an aggressive style finisher, a known finisher. All 14 of his wins have come inside the distance. And I really see him hurting Malcolm Gordon here. I see him doing it early. I think he can hurt him on the feet. Bondar likes to close distance and swing heavy shots in the pocket before trying to take the fight to the ground a lot of times. I think he can hurt Gordon there. I think he can land takedowns. I think he can get on top. And we've seen him in previous fights in top position, landing vicious ground and pound, heavy elbows on top. And Malcolm Gordon is a guy that shells up. He'll fold under that pressure. I think we see a first round knockout by Dennis Bondar. So obviously I'm in on DraftKings, but also in the betting market. I actually played a parlay this week. Almeida, Bondar and Sean Strickland, that I know will differ in the main event later. But yeah, I like Bondar. I like the knockout prop. If you get it like plus 225 or better, somewhere in that range. And the first round props as well, I think are good. Anything inside the distance with Bondar, we'll make it 4-0 on betting Malcolm Gordon fights this week.
Yeah, I certainly hope so because I think I'm going to join the train with you here on getting off the Malcolm Gordon train, I should say. I bet Dennis Bondar to win inside the distance this weekend at plus 100 for my first bet of the card. So similar line of thinking to you, John. It's interesting when we look at Bondar, this was a guy, his last fight was late in 2020. He hasn't fought in about 13 or 14 months now. It's gotten up to, was scheduled to fight 3 times in the UFC. All of them fell through. Something of note is his last fight pre-UFC was at bantamweight 135 pounds, where he's fought multiple times before. And most of his fights are at 125 pounds, where his fight this weekend will obviously be taking place. But something to note, Bondar should be the much bigger fighter than Malcolm Gordon, much stronger fighter. Most guys, even at 125 pounds, naturally have a strength advantage over Malcolm Gordon. I expect that to be the case, especially with a bigger 125 who could fight at 135. I don't think Bondar is like a super elite prospect or anything, but he is an aggressive grappler, pretty good control. On top, really pressures hard. Like when he gets on top, like you mentioned, John, he's looking to finish the fight. All his wins coming by finish. So I think that, a good portion of Bondar's win equity here comes inside of the distance. And it's just hard to really see a reliable path to victory for Malcolm Gordon. He won against Figueiredo by employing a really great game plan where he went to takedowns early and often against a fighter who struggled to defend them. I kind of just think Bondar's a better fighter everywhere this fight goes, and I expect him to get Malcolm Gordon out of there before the 15 minutes are up. Only played a unit on it just because, it is a plus 100 price tag at 125 pounds, a weight class where we don't see quite as many finishes as we do in the heavier weight classes, obviously, but I may look to get a little pop in on Bondar round one, something like that, as you kind of alluded to as well. So sounds like we are on the same page here to start, John. 12 more fights to go. I'm not sure we'll be on the same page every fight here. I think there's going to be a couple of disagreements down the line. We'll see how long it takes until we arrive at one. Anything here to add on the first fight before we keep it moving, John?
Yeah, I guess I buried the lead. My biggest bet of the card is the under 1.5. In all my Bondar love, I forgot to mention my biggest play is under 2.5 at minus 150. I really don't see this fight reaching the third round. I mentioned Gordon's been finishing the first round in almost all of his losses. Bondar tends to finish inside the first 2 rounds. He's only had 3 fights reach the final round, or maybe that's Gordon, who has had 3 fights reach the third round. And I already mentioned, I think Bondar finishes here. So minus 150, I'd be pretty shocked if that didn't come through. So I actually played that. That's a 3-unit play for me to win 2 units. And then I have a separate parlay that with another fight that we'll get to later. Basically a violence parlay. It's 2 under 2.5 parlay together. And I'll mention that when we break down the other fight that is.
Yeah, we won't have to wait too long to mention the fight that you have parlayed with that under, as we'll get to it next year. Second fight of the night, we got some interesting line movement here between Phil Rowe and Jason Witt. The line currently stands with Phil Rowe being a minus 125 favorite. He's $8.4 thousand on DraftKings. Jason Witt has been bet down significantly throughout fight week and really in the last 2 weeks. This was a guy you could see in the 135, 140 range, now down to plus 105. Looks like the line was potentially going to flip to have Jason Witt close as a favorite here. Obviously, we're about 48 hours from this fight card starting, so still possible we see Jason Witt go off as a favorite, but certainly has been a lot of market love for the Vanilla Gorilla, who's now plus 105, $7.8 thousand on DraftKings. I think this is a pretty interesting fight, John, just from a pure matchup point of view. I mean, the first thing that's going to be obvious, even before the fight begins, something that we're going to see on Friday morning at the weigh-ins, is there's a serious size discrepancy here. I mean, Phil Rowe has a 10-inch reach advantage here, a 4-inch or 5-inch height advantage over Jason Witt. Jason Witt, kind of a compact wrestler, really low center of gravity. Meanwhile, Philip Rowe is someone who kind of relies on his reach, his length. He'll TP you to the body. He fights pretty decently behind a jab. A very lanky guy, and 2 totally different body types, but also 2 totally different types of fighters here. Jason Witt, we know what he's going in there to do. He's looking to take you down early and often, get in your half guard, sit there, land some ground and pound, rack up control time. Meanwhile, Phil Rowe, I think, would like to keep this fight standing for the most part. He had some success against Kosi his last time out, working the body really well in some of those scenarios after being taken down early in the fight. I guess the biggest question in this fight here is how often is Jason Witt going to be able to get the fight to the ground? We have seen Philip Rowe taken down multiple times in both of his UFC fights, but plays a little bit of guard off his back. He does close his guard sometimes, which I don't love the visual of that, but has decent get-ups. He was able to sweep Gabe Green once or twice, has an idea of what he's doing when the fight hits the ground. I think the X factor in this fight is just how often can Phil Rowe just get right up when Jason Witt takes him down, because on the feet, I think it's going to be a blowout. Philip Rowe really fights well behind the jab. I mentioned goes to the body early and often. Jason Witt, someone who's uber fragile. We saw him knocked out in his UFC debut, obviously, against Takashi Sato. We saw him knocked out by Matthew Semmelsberger on the first punch of a fight, essentially. So there have been two of Jason Witt's 4 UFC fights have ended inside of the first minute with him eating a combined 6 significant strikes. Like, this is a guy who's very liable to go out there and get finished early. But if Philip Rowe is unable to get him out of there, I do expect Jason Witt to be able to land some takedowns, get kind of on the legs of Philip Rowe and take him to the ground here. So no bet for me. I think if you got it in on Jason Witt early, you did a solid job. But at this point, I think I'd rather play Philip Rowe at the current market at minus 125. Fortunately, I'm not forced to bet on the fight. I think I'm happy to just pass and see how this fight plays out. But John, I know you have a play here on the total. You mentioned that you had a parlay brewing between the Bondar under and then an under in this fight. Talk to me a little bit about your angle in playing the under and kind of how you were able to make a play out of it.
Yeah, I basically see the fight playing out pretty similarly in the sense that Witt's going to go for takedowns. He's probably going to have some success with that. But as much as we love Jason Witt on this show, like I don't know if I can lose any more money backing the vanilla gorilla. We'll see what happens. I mean, I'm certainly not betting Philip Rowe. He's just untrustworthy to me. I think he's super sloppy. Obviously, he has some physical advantages here that you mentioned, like the 10-inch reach advantage should be pretty huge. He's super lanky. He does have some power on the feet. I think he could hurt Witt, and Witt just gets so reckless when he's trying to go in for those takedowns. So this is a fight where I think it's going to be just really back and forth. We see in a lot of Phil Rowe fights, they're just generally really sloppy fights. And that's great for DraftKings, but it's not great in terms of if I think it's a good bet to put my money on one way or the other, just because I think there's a lot of variance. Like I just see this being a back and forth sloppy fight where Witt probably has success early with the wrestling, maybe gets clipped in the second round or something like that, and they just go back and forth like that. So it's just two guys that I just don't know if I could really trust. In terms of DraftKings, though, I think it's a great fight to target. Both guys are priced affordably in the mid-range. And like I said, I think just in general, both of these guys put on high-paced, high-scoring fights, and I think this one is going to be another one. So I'm really just focusing on this fight on DraftKings, and probably just gonna pass in terms of the betting market.
Ooh, I was muted there for a second. It took me exactly 2 fights to not unmute myself prior to talking about a fight. I don't have much to add there. I kind of do agree that like moments of this fight, I do think will be dominant, John. Like I do think like when Witt gets on top, it's gonna be no doubt who's winning, obviously, and when they're striking, I think it'll be no doubt. But I wouldn't be surprised if there were like a couple swings of momentum, unless of course Jason Witt just gets like dead end on one of his first punches of the fight. Yeah, instantly, 2 strikes in, because that tends to happen with Jason Witt fights. But I am looking forward to the fight. I think it's interesting kind of who will be able to enforce their game plan more. Let's move on here to the third fight of the night, which features our first Contender Series alum who's making his UFC debut on this card. So, John, we'll go to you here first. We got Jon Almeida, currently a minus 425 favorite, up there with the biggest favorite on the card. He's $9.4 thousand against Danilo Marquez. Plus 320, 6.8K for Danilo Marquez. And John, one thing I wanted to mention before kicking this fight to you to break down the Almeida side and what you think of the fight overall is last week, or 2 weeks ago, I should say, on UFC 270, we saw guys like Genaro Valdez come into that fight against Matt Frevola, where he was a massive favorite on Contender Series, like 20-1 level favorite on Contender Series, had a lot of market respect, won, and then had a decent amount of market respect going into a fight against a really tough Matt Frevola, who is a solid UFC opponent. Here, when you look at Jon Almeida, this is a guy who closed as a plus 150, plus 160 underdog on Contender Series, puts on an impressive performance, and now comes into the UFC as a 4-1 favorite. Really different situation. A guy who seemingly the market seems to respect a lot more after his Contender Series fight compared to what he was perceived as prior to Contender Series. So talk to me a little bit about kind of if you think Almeida is maybe underrated or probably not underrated, but if he's overrated coming into this matchup, or maybe he was just underrated going into Contender Series. What do you make of him as a prospect? And then what are his chances this weekend as the biggest favorite on the card?
Yeah, good question. I think he was probably a little bit underrated coming into the Contender Series matchup against Nasruddinov, but part of that too was because his matchup was impressive as well. Like it wasn't the fact that people were sleeping on him; it was just the fact that his opponent was very good. So, but in terms of this, like minus 400, minus 450, whatever he's being steamed up to now, like I get it if people are like, oh, it's another Dana White Contender Series guy debuting and he's a massive favorite, like I'm just going to fade it. Like I just don't think this is personally the spot against Danilo Marquez. It's just styles make fights, and this is a really difficult matchup for him. I know he's going to be a little bit taller, but I do not think he's going to be able to muscle Almeida against the cage, look for takedowns. Like that's Almeida's world too. He's a black belt. I think he's probably a better grappler. I think he's stronger, and I think on the feet he has a clear advantage. So I actually pretty much favor him wherever the fight goes. And Marquez is a guy who we've seen even when he does have success implementing that game plan, he gasses out as well. Like I don't see this being a good matchup for him. I could see him trying to do his usual stick to you like glue type game plan, but not having much success, and then gassing out, trying to do so, and honestly probably getting finished in maybe the second or third round. So I just think Almeida is the side here, even though the price tag is expensive. I think it's pretty warranted.
Yeah, it's interesting because you look at Almeida on Contender Series, he looked pretty strong there. Obviously, his takedown game is solid, right? He goes to a double leg, he could transition to a single leg once or twice in that fight. Also ended up on bottom a few times in that matchup, but I think something that you kind of contextualize well is there's a decent chance that Nasruddinov, his opponent on Contender Series, is just a better fighter than Danilo Marquez, despite Marquez being 2-1 at the UFC level. Something I did want to just touch on real quick, Marquez, I think originally when he was called up to the UFC, he got the Khadis Ibragimov matchup, the Mike Rodriguez matchups. We kind of thought that this guy was maybe going to be the worst light heavyweight on the roster, and he kind of stuck it to us, won both fights, and then in the Kennedy fight last time out, was clearly winning 2-0. And I was kind of thinking, like, man, was I just really wrong on Danilo Marquez? Like, can a single leg really get you to the top 15, top 20 at 205 pounds? Obviously, he gasses out like 20 seconds into round 3 in that matchup. But my point here is that for as much shit as kind of we've given Danilo Marquez is he hasn't really lost a ton of minutes at the UFC level. The one issue I have here, as much as I would love to fade the Dana White Contender Series alum at minus 400, is it's kind of tough to see a path to victory for Marquez. Like his best strength is grappling, like you mentioned, kind of just has one takedown. He's able to backpack you, but it's mostly the single leg. I don't even think he's going to be the better grappler in this matchup. I think he probably has inferior cardio. I think physically he's weaker than Almeida is. So it's just tough. I mean, look, the last time I said that I thought someone might be value at their price tag, but didn't necessarily have a clear path to victory was Benson Henderson at like plus 350 on Bellator last week that came through. But honestly, I just don't think that there's really a clear path for Marquez to win the fight, despite the fact that I think minus 400 is a little bit crazy considering the fact that Almeida didn't look flawless or anything like that on Contender Series. I think there's definitely some weaknesses to his game, but he did fight a decent opponent on Contender Series. I'm glad we contextualized that. I think he goes out there and gets a win this weekend, but I'm not sure he's a guy who I want to be, looking to play on at minus 400 too consistently against guys other than Danilo Marquez. So we'll see kind of going forward what the prices look like on Almeida, who they might match him up with next, assuming he gets through this UFC debut flawlessly. Let's move on here to the only women's fight on the card. We got Alexis Davis as a minus 240 favorite. She's 8.7K on DraftKings against Julija Stoliarenko, comes back plus 195. Stoliarenko, $7,500 on DraftKings. Man, I could go really quick on this fight. Did not spend much time on it. Really easy pass for me. Stoliarenko, we know what she is, right? She's super tough. She's in there for the full 15 minutes against most of her opponents. You're unlikely to put her away. Her offense is mostly armbar or bust. A lot of her fights take place against the fence. Super ugly fights. Alexis Davis, speaking of ugly, like her fights are just never pretty. She's someone who just is not. She's not the most technically sound fighter in the world, but we got to give her credit, right? She's fought basically the who's who of this weight class, all the way from Ronda Rousey to Jennifer Maia, Chukagian. Like Alexis Davis has fought everyone in this weight class, and she's been competitive with a lot of them. I think she's probably way better than Stoliarenko, but I'm not laying minus 240. Like I would not be surprised if Stoliarenko just gets one of her 8 armbar finishes here. Something crazy happens. So the price is probably accurate on Alexis Davis. I just have no real interest in laying a minus 240 on this level of women's MMA. So nothing for me here. John, anything for you in Davis versus Stoliarenko?
Yeah, I have an interesting question for you. If you had to rank, probably more interesting than this matchup. So if you had to rank the on a level of 1 to 10, 10 being the worst, or actually just rank the 3 fighters. So who has the worst scar tissue out of Nate Diaz, Darren Elkins, and Alexis Davis?
Oh shit, that's a great question. I think you probably got to go Nate first, and that might be results bias because he gets fight stopped via cuts like consistently, it feels like, or at least the doctor called in. So I'll go Nate, maybe just because he's like the most famous out of all of them. Elkins has got to be last because like Elkins is just out of this world tough. Like he could have, not that the other 2 fighters aren't tough, but like Darren Elkins' face could be completely scar tissue, and he's just bleeding seconds into a fight, and he's just blindly shooting a single leg with no eyes whatsoever, not able to see anything, blood dripping down his face. So we'll say Nate Diaz is the worst. We'll put Alexis Davis in the middle, and we'll give the damage some credit, and we'll say he is I don't want to say the best, but the least prohibitive scar tissue out of the 3 options listed.
Okay, I respect it. Yeah, I just figured that'd be funner to talk about than this matchup. But
Confirmed.
But yeah, so I don't have much to add. Stoliarenko, we know by now she's pretty much early armbar or bust, and now she's facing a BJJ black belt, someone who we've seen face better grapplers than Stoliarenko and stay safe for the most part. I think that happens here. The only other thing I would add is this could be a spot where it's like nobody plays it on DraftKings because it's a women's fight. It's a boring fight. Alexis Davis is expensive. It's probably warranted, but it's probably just a boring decision. And not that I disagree with that completely, but I could see this being a spot where, and we've seen it, stuff like that happen in the past, where if you're playing the main tournament on DraftKings, that could be the fight that gets you, that makes your lineup unique and jolts you to the top of the leaderboard. Like, just because, like, would it shock you if Davis landed like 6-7 takedowns here? Like if Stoliarenko just like kept working back to her feet, or Davis just like lands 3 or 4 takedowns, but has like 14 minutes of control, a bunch of ground and pound, like something like that, to where she ends up scoring super, super high, even without a finish, or maybe she gets like a late 3rd round stoppage. Stoliarenko has, you know, like she's just as big of a punching bag as Davis is, if not worse. So it could be maybe a you know, if you want to get unique in the large field tournaments, if you're playing multiple lineups, this could be one of those fights where everyone's writing it off. You get someone at low ownership and they just end up crushing their score. So that's the only thing that I'm kind of thinking through about this fight, as just a way to get unique.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to say, like, probably more likely that Stoliarenko pulls guard for like arm bars when against the fence, and those go for takedowns statistically
Most of the time,
for
yeah.
Alexis Davis. Yeah, and I mean, it's just a classic like pay up to be contrarian spot. Like, obviously you're not enthused by it, but who's looking at the DraftKings pricing this weekend? You see Bunahele Soriano at 8.6K. You see Sean Strickland at 8.8K. Who is clicking Alexis Davis in the middle of those two names, sort of deal? And look, the people don't forget Alexis Davis once upon a time scored like 112 DraftKings points against Amanda Nunes like a decade ago. So the upside is there. It's possible. Those were back in the Strikeforce days. Not sure she has that type of upside in this matchup, but like you mentioned, like, you pay up to be contrarian. Not something I'm doing in a lot of lineups, but if I'm running 150 this weekend, something I'll definitely consider on Saturday morning as I start to make those teams. Let's move on here to a bit more of an intriguing fight from a betting standpoint. We got Marc-Andre Barriault. He's minus 120 here against UFC newcomer Chidi and Jukwani. He's plus 100. The DraftKings prices here are Barriault 8.2K, and Jukwani is 8K flat on DraftKings. Chidi didn't come off Contender Series, but Chidi's been around like a long time. He's fought in Bellator, a couple of other big promotions. No, he did fight. He fought on Contender Series despite fighting in Bellator and a bunch of other promotions. So a guy who, to me, is not like your classic Contender Series bomb. Like, I actually think that Chidi is a pretty solid guy for this weight class, despite this being his UFC debut. He's been around a long time, fought a decent level of competition in a couple of big promotions. However, I do think that this is a decent spot to bet on Marc-Andre Barriault, which it feels like I do almost every time out. I took him at minus 110 this weekend for a unit. Small play. Don't think it's better for, or I don't think it's good for much better than minus 110. Like, I wouldn't play him much past that number. I think it's pretty much towards the end of the range where I would hop on Marc-Andre Barriault, but there's still minus 110s out there. I bet it, I think Fox Bet earlier today. A couple of other sports books still have that Barriault minus 110 line. Just a spot where, you know, Marc-Andre Barriault is in a weight class where cardio and durability take you a really far way, and that's two things that he most certainly possesses. His striking is getting a little bit better. His wrestling is getting a little bit better. He pushes you up against the cage, but really, for the most part, what Marc-Andre Barriault is a guy who's super hard to hurt and a guy who builds as fights go on, gets stronger in the second round, and then his strongest round is typically the 3rd round. And Chidi, on the other hand, is someone who I think will be successful in some UFC fights. Like, I definitely do think this guy's UFC level. I think he's pretty skilled, has solid knees in the clinch, has a couple of elbows. His clinch work in general is decent, but I think he's the inferior wrestler in this matchup. He's not super high output or high power at a distance in terms of striking. Like, he's not really going to put you out with one punch. He's not really going to go out there and throw 100 significant strikes. So I kind of just expect Marc-Andre Barriault to pull a Marc-Andre Barriault, push him against the cage, make him uncomfortable, and break him down the stretch. You know, we've seen Chidi broken in a couple of fights historically. He's like, when guys put it on Chidi, they're able to get him out of there. You know, he's a guy who doesn't necessarily handle adversity as well as other fighters. And I think he's talented, but Marc-Andre Barriault, man, I think he's getting better, has that cardio and durability, and he's not the most skilled guy in the world, but that's really all you need at this type of weight class. Like, the John Salter fight in Bellator comes to mind for Chidi. Like, he just got taken down, and I don't want to say he quit, but like, seriously had trouble overcoming adversity in that matchup. And obviously, anytime you just look at a guy's losses, it's easy to poke holes in their games. But I think this is a pretty solid matchup in terms of the overall skill level. But I'll take Marc-Andre Barriault, just more proven guy, better cardio, better durability. I think he'll be able to dictate where the fight goes. So I bet him at minus 110 For a unit, John, anything from you here in Barriault versus Jukwani?
Yeah, I think that was a really great breakdown. First of all, I don't have a ton to add because I basically see it pretty similarly. Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, excellent nickname by the way. Obviously there's some tools to like about him. You know, he's long, he's rangy, good striker. I think he's actually a black belt as well, even though the grappling is a little bit suspect from what we've seen. But Marc-Andre Barriault, I think you hit on it. Like, I think it's a close fight where I'm going to side with the guy who I know has clearly better cardio and I know who's more durable. Like, that's kind of what it comes down to for me. I think it's going to be primarily a striking match. We're going to see some clinch work. In Jukwani, that's probably his best chance here, is to just try to clinch as much as possible. He's very strong in the clinch. Got good knees. He's hurt people to the body with his knees. He's got good elbows in the clinch. But I'm with you. I favor Barriault. I think even though I kind of get frustrated with his activity at times, I think he's at least sort of improved that in his last couple fights. We've seen the volume, the pace ramp up a little bit, trying to chase finishes a little bit more like he did back on the regional scene. And you mentioned it, and Jukwani is a guy who we've seen fold under the pressure in the past. And if this fight goes to the later rounds and Barriault's still putting it on him and has the cardio, I think I'll side with the Barriault side. But more than likely, I think it's probably going to decision. I think there's better fights to target on this slate, though.
Yeah, you mentioned the output for Marc-Andre Barriault as fights go on. He's definitely improved on that. I think he's landed like 125 strikes between round 3 and his fight against Dalcha Lungiambula his last time out, and then in the Zatar fight combined, those two fights combined, I think he landed like 125 significant strikes in the 3rd round. So certainly doing a better job of like putting a real pace on his opponent's slate, because we knew he was capable of doing it. It was just like, go out there, do something. So glad he's kind of gotten that under control. Any interest in you in like the goes the distance market? Not to put you on the spot, but it's like -1 between -120 and -140. I thought that was interesting before settling on playing Barriault on the money line. I just thought that was kind of an interesting look between two guys that I think are relatively durable. And question for you there.
I think -120 is playable for sure. I didn't even look at that, to be honest with you, but I'll take a peek after the show because like you, I'm expecting a decision here. I wouldn't be super shocked at a finish. I think if there is a finish, it probably comes from Barriault. But I think we probably see like 29-28, maybe a split one way or the other. But I'll side with Barriault.
-122 on FanDuel, currently the best price in the market on the fight going the distance. One last thing on this fight is just, I've talked on this show before about how in women's MMA specifically at weight classes higher than like 125 pounds, I've historically kind of underrated physicality and just physical tools. Like Tyler Santos comes to mind, where she's just stronger than some of her opponents. And back when she wasn't as talented in the grappling in terms of like technically speaking, she's just able to outmuscle girls. I feel like 185 at the men's division is like the perfect weight class for where durability and cardio can just take you so far, because you're not to the point where like everyone has cardio at 125 pounds. Like who really gasses out besides the fake Figgy brother at 125 pounds really bad?
I was going to say, I could think of a couple.
Yeah. And it's not like 100, it's not 265 pounds where like one punch can put you out and the idea of durability can be shattered kind of with just one punch. So that's why I lean so heavily on those attributes for Barriault, and that's my reasoning for playing him this weekend. We can move on here to a featherweight bout that I think should be pretty fun. We got Hakeem Dawadu returning as a -170 favorite here. He's $8.5 thousand. He takes on Mike Trisano, who's +150, 7.7K for Trisano on DraftKings. Should be primarily a striking matchup, I would imagine here. We haven't seen Hakeem Dawadu, who pulled out of the Shane Burgos fight last January, then came back, lost a pretty one-sided fight to Movsar Evloev. He now returns after, close to 6 months off. I know there's been some injury talk in the Hakeem Dawadu camp coming into this fight, but he's a favorite here against Mike Trizano, who I thought looked pretty decent in a controversial win against Ludovic Klein his last time out, but we cashed on Mike Trizano in that spot, so no complaining on my end. John, seems to be a fight that'll stay standing for the majority of the 15 minutes and should be relatively competitive. A lot of split decisions from each of these guys. Any one way that you're leaning as of now?
I mean, I'm no bet for me either way, but I am leaning towards the Dawadu side. I think I don't know. I feel like people are trying to force Trizano dog just because he came through as a big dog against Klein. I could be wrong on that, but that just seems like sort of the vibe that I'm getting this week. I've seen a lot of love for Trisano. And I mean, look, Trisano's a great fighter. I just think this is kind of a tough matchup for him against a guy who I think has much better footwork, who's going to be faster, going to have a clear speed advantage. I think he's a better boxer for sure. So I don't know. We'll see what the game plan is for Trisano, because he's a guy who does have, a wrestling background. He just doesn't use it at the UFC level. And that's so frustrating, especially in a matchup like this against Dawadu, who is very difficult to control, but you could probably take him down here. So, but I don't trust Trisano to do that. So I think we see a striking match where I favor Dawadu's activity. I favor his quickness. I favor his hands. And I think that's going to be the difference maker. I do think it's going to be a competitive fight, but I'll say 29-28 Dawadu. But this one, I think for sure goes to decision.
Yeah, in terms of the wrestling from the Trisano side, I don't want to steal anyone's thunder, but a shout out to our boy Martian MMA. I think it's at UFO_UFC. He obviously has his podcast with our buddy Ozzy, but some intel from the Trisano camp. I would be surprised if they wrestled this weekend. We'll obviously let him share all the news he's dug out, but just for our listeners, I would be surprised if Trisano kind of goes to a wrestling heavy game plan. I expect this to stay standing. John, you mentioned a lot of love on Trisano. That's been reflected in the market, right? 2 weeks ago when we were after the UFC 270, limits go up a little bit. They're no longer look at headlines for this card, this fight night card. You can get Trisano like plus 168, plus 170 on some market making books. Now I see him as low as plus 142 at some of the sharper books. So about 25 cents a line movement here in the favor of Trisano. I actually bet this fight to go the distance at minus 190 on DraftKings, which feels like a little bit of a steep price to pay at 145 pounds. But you just go back and look at these guys' fights. Not really instinctual finishers, either one of them, and pretty durable guys on both ends. A little bit of a worry with Dawadu coming off of injury, but for the most part, I think it's a close fight. I was intrigued by Trisano early on in that plus 170 range. He got bet down. I'm honestly fine to pass. The more I look into it, Hakeem Dawadu is a hard guy to outstrike at distance. If Trisano is not even going to mix in a takedown or two, he's literally never been outstruck before. Goes to the leg kicks, outstruck at distance, I should say. Goes to the leg kicks, early and often. Those were kind of taken away against Evloev because that's a guy who will catch your kick and turn it into a takedown. But Hakeem has landed I think 25 leg kicks in the fight prior to Evloev, a guy who will consistently go to leg kicks. And that's some of the most consistent offense you can get in terms of stand up and scoring points in a fight that I really favor to go the distance. So I played the goes to decision at minus 190 on DraftKings earlier today. Should still be out there. I just don't think either one of these guys is a huge finisher, and I don't think it's to be fought at a super high pace. Neither guy goes out there and lands a ton of strikes. The only time that either one of them really put on a ton of significant strikes in the performance was in Hakeem Dawadu, his only UFC knockout. He just kind of ramped up the volume late on in the fight, gets the knockout in the third round, but it was kind of accumulation of damage. I don't expect either guy to get finished in this spot. So despite there being little grappling on the table, in my opinion, I think goes the distance to better than minus 200 is a solid spot to lay a little bit of chalk this weekend on Saturday. We can move on here, John, to an interesting fight. We got Miles Johns minus 190. He's 8.9K on DraftKings against Jon Castaneda, who comes back plus 160 currently. He's $7.3 thousand on DraftKings. And I have a pretty good idea, I think, of what Miles Johns is at this point in time. I think he's a guy who hits pretty hard for the weight class. His stand-up is improving a little bit. His wrestling is good, very compact, strong guy. He doesn't go to his wrestling in every fight, which is a little bit frustrating, but back-to-back third-round knockouts, someone who I thought at the beginning of his career was someone who slows down a little bit as fights goes on. He carries a decent amount of muscle at 135 pounds, but seems to be, pushing back against that narrative a little bit. I kind of think of Miles Johns as someone who's not quite as good as his skill set is. For whatever reason, I think he's a good wrestler, think he's got decent power, but for whatever reason, it just doesn't feel like he's put it together to be a great fighter yet. And then with Jon Castaneda, that's where I'm really struggling. I mentioned I kind of think I know where Miles Johns is at. Maybe, John, you can point me in a direction here for Castaneda. It's you're shaking your head no for the people listening. It's hard to tell where this guy is at. He comes in UFC debut. Well, he wins on Contender Series, comes in UFC debut against Nathaniel Wood. I believe this is a road game in England for that fight, or maybe that was in Abu Dhabi on Fight Island against Nathaniel Wood. It's a plus 350 underdog to a really talented prospect. Basically got blown out of the water as expected. Then people don't know what to expect. He faces an aging Eddie Wineland, closes as a small favorite and blows out Eddie Wineland. But then after the fight, you can kind of think, well, that was that because Castaneda's improving? Was that because Castaneda wasn't fighting a top 15 opponent? Or is that just because Castaneda was fighting a washed Eddie Wineland at that point in time? really hard guy for me to kind of put my wrap my brain around where he's at. Part of me thinks that Castaneda is live as an underdog just because I don't think Johns is that great to cover minus 190 against decent fighters consistently. But on the other hand, like maybe Jon Castaneda is just fooling us all with the Wineland performance, and Miles Johns goes out there and treats him like, I don't know, a Kevin Natividad or someone who he put away fairly easily. So all that to say, no action for me on the fight. If you can point me in a direction on Jon Castaneda, or maybe just give me your thoughts on the matchup as a whole here. A tough fight to call, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat as you. I think Castaneda, I side with. I don't think he's very good. Like he's okay. He's got a decently well-rounded skill set, but I think Wineland's kind of busted at this point. He probably the best performance I think we'll see out of Castaneda. But like you said, Miles Johns, I think he could for sure cover minus 200 if he were to wrestle. But we can't trust him to do that. Like the dude was like an all-American wrestler. And then even on Contender Series went to his wrestling, and we haven't seen it since. Like now he's just a straight up pure boxer, and his boxing has looked good. You mentioned the power in his hands. He does hit hard. He's got powerful hooks. He's liable to hurt people on the feet, but Castaneda's super durable. I wish Johns would wrestle here because I think that's a clear minute winning potential every single round for him. Castaneda has been taken down multiple times, not super urgent to work back to his feet, mostly on the regional scene. But I just think Johns, I favor him to win. I don't want to pay anywhere near that price. So the pick is Johns, but it's not one that I'm super interested in. I think he has a little bit more upside on DraftKings, but like you, I feel like Castaneda is kind of a bum, but I'm also not like super confident in that. Like there's some guys where I'm like, yeah, that dude's horrible. Like not even going to waste my time. Castaneda, I'm like leaning towards he's probably not going to win at this level, but at the same time, I wouldn't be like super shocked if he did, especially considering Johns is not like, he's not championship material. But yeah, all that to say, I think Johns has a little bit more upside on DraftKings just because, maybe he finally wrestles or maybe he just drops Castaneda. But I believe Castaneda's never been knocked out before. He's been super durable. So maybe that's not a super likely outcome either way.
My theory on Miles Johns wrestling is I think he's like hyper aware of his tendency to slow down late in fights. And I think he's just trying to conserve as much energy as he can. And now he's realizing like, hey, I can knock guys out in the third round if I don't wrestle, but that might work against Anderson Dos Santos, Kevin Natividads of the division. I think as he starts moving up in the weight class, he's going to want to wrestle a little bit and has to figure out how to conserve energy. But, I could also be totally wrong, but that's kind of my theory on the Miles Johns wrestling is that he's very aware of the fact that he slows down late in fights when he's forced to push like a tremendous pace. So maybe that's nothing, but that's my theory for now. Let's move on to the next fight here. We got Juicy J. Julian Arosa is minus 310, $9,200 on DraftKings against Steven Peterson, who comes back plus 245. It's our underdog. He's 7K flat on DK. John, I saw you had a bet posted in the bet tracker on FTN bets for this matchup. A long shot prop. I see plus 950 in the bet tracker, my friend. Talk to me about what are we rolling the dice on this weekend between Julian Arosa and Steven Peterson?
Yeah, it could be just because I'm a Steven Peterson homer. Like I've bet this dude so many different ways. I would think early on in his career, I think I cashed like a big inside the distance, or maybe it was a knockout prop at like 750 or something like that. And like ever since then, I'm like, this dude's awesome. He's going to go at a high pace, throw spinning back fist. He's going to pull guillotine, even though he's probably not going to finish it, but he's just super high action. And now he's facing someone in Julian Arosa who does have legitimate skill set, right? But he's been knocked out 5 times in his career. We know how reckless he is. Like he's willing to go to war, and he just doesn't have the chin to fight that style. And I know Steven Peterson is not like a super like hardcore knockout guy. Obviously, I mentioned the spinning back fist knockout, but he's had a couple other ones as well. I bet him by knockout against Chase Hooper, and he came dangerously close to cashing that. That was like a plus 600. But yeah, Hooper stayed alive, obviously, because that's how cold I've been running on my long shot props. But that's not stopping me. We're going back to the long shot prop this week. I bet Steven Peterson by knockout at plus 950. And listen, I know some of you are probably like, Steven Peterson by knockout, like whatever, like that's a terrible bet. But I still bet it for a unit. This is just a spot where whenever these these spots present themselves, I'm always going to fire at it. You know, Julian Arosa, super fragile, fight super reckless. And I do think Steven Peterson has finishing ability, and he's going to fight at a high pace. I could see this just being a super high pace back and forth war. And I think Peterson's more likely to finish than whatever the 10% implied odds would indicate. So I played it for a unit at FanDuel plus 950. Rest of the market's like plus 800. So you're getting the best number there as well. But yeah, that was my take on it. In terms of DraftKings, I do think this is a good fight to target, because while I just kind of shit all over Julian Arosa, he is a talented fighter, and I think he's capable of finishing as well. I know Peterson is historically durable, never been submitted, yada, yada, yada. But Arosa, he's just, he's been hurting dudes on the feet. He's obviously got the dangerous submission skills as well. But yeah, I just, like I said, I think it's going to be a back and forth one. I think Peterson has a better chance to finish than a plus 950 would indicate.
Yeah, so John, not to I know you just talked for like 5 minutes about the fight, not to make you give you the spotlight for too long here without a break, but one thing I wanted to mention that I think you may not have touched on in your breakdown, but something I know you bet this week is, so Underdog Fantasy launched their Pick'em MMA product, and it's something that I think is pretty beatable at this point in time. I don't want to make it too hot. I don't want everyone to be hopping on the bandwagon. We're not going to be able to make any money anymore, but basically they come out with lines, significant strikes, takedown attempts for each fighter, or the fighters on the main card for each UFC slate or whatnot. John and I essentially crushed last weekend. You basically are parlaying a couple of outcomes together. John, if I'm not mistaken, something that you felt strongly about this weekend on Underdog was the Steven Peterson under 1.5 takedowns. We may have moved the market on that one. It might be at 1. I got to double check right now, but that's an angle that I think you were interested in. Anything you want to talk about just in terms of the Underdog game for a second here?
Yeah, first off, love that pick'em format over on Underdog. Love their product in general. And this is actually unexpected, but since you brought it up, I'm actually going to start doing a video series each week on my YouTube channel. So be on the lookout for that, where I'm specifically talking about the pick'em format for Underdog each week, the plays that I like, just a short, like 10-minute video, 5-10 minutes, whatever, talking about the pick'em format for Underdog. So be on the lookout for that. I'm hoping to start that this week. If that's the case, it should be up by tomorrow, but we'll see what happens. But yeah, I do think that under 1.5 takedowns for Steven Peterson is a great pick there. Also later in the main event, Sean Strickland under 2.5 takedowns, absurd line.
I think I already moved that one.
Yeah, that was like the placeholder. You always find one over there, and you're like, all right, I'm running this in like 5 different teams, But yeah, I just think Peterson, while he has looked to land takedowns in the past, I don't think that he's going to be looking to do that super often against Julian Arosa, but also, he's a guy that pulls guillotine a lot. Like I could see Arosa landing takedowns on him. Also, a finish gets you there as well. There's just a lot of outs for that not to hit. So I really don't think he's going to land 2 or more takedowns. But yeah, shout out to Underdog. That pick'em format's super fun.
It is super fun. It sounds like the edge may go away soon once you give away all the secrets. So for those of you listening on Thursday before the video on Friday, you get the goods a day early. We'll mention a couple of those kind of as we go on throughout the show. You can also use code FTN at when you deposit for 100% bonus, I believe up to $100 if you guys are interested. Fun format. Had a lot of fun with it last week. I think it's going to be super beatable, at least for the time being in the MMA streets, until John takes away all the edges and we also win enough money that they start putting out a little bit better lines. But let's move on to the next fight here. We got 2 guys coming off of The Ultimate Fighter. We got Trisano Gore minus 160 making his UFC debut after originally, I believe this fight was slated to be the Ultimate Fighter finale. Trisano Gore was forced to pull out. Brian Battle then fought Gilbert Urbina for the Ultimate Fighter title. Brian Battle obviously won the fight in the second round. Current market is Gore minus 160, Battles plus 140 in a matchup that's been brewing for a hot minute here. A lot of people thought that Trisano Gore was like clearly the best fighter on this season of The Ultimate Fighter. And I'm not sure how much I agree with that. I'll say Trisano Gore only has 3 professional fights. I will say he's got a solid low kick. He throws a decent 1-2, seems to hit decently hard, in his fight against Gilbert Urbina, who I will say Brian Battle struggled with in his UFC debut. Both of these guys, that's a common opponent they had. I was at the fight between Battle and Battle and Urbina. I just didn't think that Battle looked that great physically. He seems to be in much better shape. You know, you don't want to trust the IG flicks too much, but he seems to be in better shape now than he was for that UFC debut. And I went back and watched the fight, and it was rough in the first round for him against Urbina. Like, he faced a lot more adversity than I remembered, was able to come back. He got the win in the second round. But back to Trisano Gore, you know, a lot of people thought he's like the best fighter by far. You know, I think probably Andre Petrovsky is going to end up being the best fighter on that show, coming off of that show. But you know, Gore's a favorite here. I understand that. I think he's a way better athlete than Bryan Battle, at least early on in fights, but he's relatively untested. He's been to decision one time, not many professional fights, obviously has some experience on The Ultimate Fighter, a decent amateur career prior to going pro. I don't know. I kind of think that the value side here is on Bryan Battle. I haven't pulled the trigger, and I'm not sure at plus 145, just because I think, you know, if the guy's losing early rounds to Gilbert Urbina, I think he's probably going to lose the first round of Trisano Gore. Maybe we get a live line here in Bryan Battle at like plus 200, maybe a round 2 or round 3 prop for a guy who's proven he can overcome some sort of adversity. You know, Trisano Gore definitely hits hard. When he fought Gilbert Urbina, he dropped him like 4 times with the same punch, which I think was more of a knock on Urbina than it was like a compliment to Gore. I mean, Urbina just kept walking into the same exact shot like repeatedly. But bottom line here is I expect Gore to win early on in this fight, to be winning the first round, but I would not be surprised to see like a big swing of momentum here. I think that Bryan Battle does just a little bit more in terms of output and is more battle tested, pun kind of wasn't intended, and then I said it and it kind of became intended. But I think that Battle is going to be able to kind of come back in this fight later on. So I might look to play Bryan Battle live, maybe a round 2 or round 3 prop. I think I saw PointsBet had like 18-1 round 3 for Battle. Seems pretty good if you ask me, but I haven't pulled the trigger on anything here yet. John, anything for you in the Ultimate Fighter finale take 2?
Yeah, you know, I don't blame people for taking the shot on the underdog in Bryan Battle. I mean, I really don't think he's that good, and that doesn't mean he can't be value. Like I've spent a lot of time making that clear. Like, you can make value bets on bad fighters. It just depends on the matchup. I'm just not sure that this is a good matchup for him. I think Trisano Gore is going to be a lot better than him on the feet, much faster. I think he's going to be clearly winning the minutes while it plays outstanding. It's just a matter of, you know, is Battle going to look to be the aggressor here? Because in most of his fights, he's kind of just doing whatever his opponents do. And yes, he's well-rounded enough to where he can kind of hang wherever the fight goes, but also it just doesn't look good. Like, he's going to get backed up against the fence if Gore wants to do that, if Gore wants to stay at range. Like, I don't know if I trust Battle to close distance, clinch up, look for takedowns, anything like that. And that's really how I want to be targeting if I'm fading Trisano Gore. Like, I want somebody that I know is going to like an Andre Petrosky, like you said, obviously super gassy, but at least we know he's going to like force him to defensively wrestle, defensively grapple. And I'm not convinced that Bryan Battle's going to do that. I know he's done some grappling in his last couple fights, but that's because his opponents were the ones to take the fight there. And Trisano Gore, I would think, is not going to do that. I think he wants to keep the fight standing where he has a clear advantage. And I think he does that here. If it was a bigger number, then I'd be like, all right, sure, it's low level. Like, obviously, similar to Ultimate Fighter, Dana White Contender Series, obviously the value is almost always on the underdog, unless it's, you know, a unique situation. But it's just not a big enough number for me. Plus 140, plus 150, whatever. I would probably need a plus 200. I really don't think Bryan Battle is really all that talented. Not that Trisano Gore is, but I just think in this matchup, he's going to be able to keep the fight where he needs it to be, to where he does look like a sizable favorite on the feet.
Josh asked in the chat, are you worried at all about the knee injury from Trisano Gore here? He wasn't able to fight in August. It's obviously been, you know, 6 months probably since he was forced to pull out of that fight. I'm not too worried about it personally. And John, it sounds like you're higher on the Gore side than me. So any thoughts on kind of the injury, coming off of the injury here?
Yeah, I mean, it's always possible that could hamper them in the fight, but I mean, stuff like that, like, I would just be guessing if I had to take one way or the other. Like, unless somebody legitimately somebody in the know knows something, like, how I honestly would have no idea. So I'm just gonna break it down as I see how the fight plays out, and I try to do as little of the guessing work as possible, because that just increases variance. So I'm going to trust my reads and hope that I'm getting a healthy fighter. I mean, I don't have money on Gore, but I'm just saying, like, in terms of how I see the fight playing out.
Yeah, last thing on the fight, just kind of my subjective take here is there's a plus 145 at BetMGM on Brian Battle, which isn't necessarily super off market. DraftKings is a plus 140. I think FanDuel's at plus 135 or so. Don't think you're getting better than a plus 145. Sometimes these fight day markets get a little bit wonky, but I would be surprised if a significant amount of Trisano Gore money came in over the next few days. I kind of think the Brian Battle's been the sharp side throughout the week, and I kind of expect that those plus 145s to kind of disappear and turn into 135s as we get towards Saturday night. But you never know. But just my opinion, if you're looking to back the Brian Battle side, which I have not put any money down, I think now would be the time to get involved. Just my opinion. Let's move on here, John. We got 4 fights left on UFC Vegas 47. We got Brendan Allen currently stepping up as a late notice replacement here. Despite the late notice, he's a minus 410 favorite against Smiling Sam Alvey, who's not won a fight in like 7 years at this point. Plus 310, $6.9 thousand on DK for Smiling Sam Alvey, who originally was slated to fight Phil Hawes. There were some people who were excited to play Sam Alvey in that spot. I got to say, I was not one of them. I remain not excited to play Sam Alvey in this spot against Brendan Allen, but it's an interesting matchup from the point of view that, I'm pretty high on Brendan Allen as a prospect. Obviously got knocked out in his last fight as a pretty big favorite. I was surprised by that result for sure. But he's a guy who I think does best primarily as a grappler, we can all agree. And Sam Alvey at an 81% takedown defense over a massive sample size is a tough guy to take down. That being said, there are multiple ways to beat Sam Alvey, and just doing things at distance as opposed to staring at your opponent is one of them. And I kind of expect that to be the way that Brendan Allen gets it done this weekend. Minus 400 seems like a pretty prohibitive price for me to play on a guy who got knocked out recently, who's primarily a grappler, who's facing a guy with decent takedown defense. But I, at the same time, am not at all interested in playing the Sam Alvey side. Kind of think the goes the distance is interesting. FanDuel opened, I think, plus 148 on goes the distance. Pretty low levels when I checked a couple of hours ago. The market had just opened. I expect that to close closer to plus 100. That's where some of the sharper books are kind of already headed towards that plus 115, plus 120 direction. I might take a 1-unit shot on this fight to go the distance at plus 148, but at the same time, I'm not super intrigued by it. Like, I could see if Allen gets him down, just a pretty immediate submission, but Alvey isn't a terrible grappler, and I don't think Allen hits it extremely hard, and I don't think that Alvey's going to win by KO. So I think going the distance at plus 148 is pretty solid. But at the same time, given the short notice nature of the fight, the Sam Alvey being involved portion of the fight, it might be a fight where I just would choose to have $0 on it and feel pretty good about that decision. So no action for me as of now. Tempted by the ghosted decision on FanDuel. Going to need them to up the limits a little bit, and then we'll see if we can get involved at plus 148. But that's kind of all I've got here, John. Anything for you in Alvey versus Allen?
Yeah, that goes to decision prop. It has me tempted as well. I really think we do see a decision here. I think we see a Brendan Allen decision. I think he's just going to move forward, back up Sam against the cage, which he loves. Sam will do that automatically, but especially against a pressure fighter like Brendan Allen. You mentioned the grappling, but it's kind of funny because Brendan Allen, we've talked about it before, like he doesn't always look to take the fight to the ground, even though that's his best skill set. And like even in this fight, like if he does, Alvey has pretty good takedown defense. He's tough to get down. So, and we know Allen's comfortable striking anyway, probably going to be winning the striking minutes. So I think it might just be Allen backing him up against the cage and just boxing him for 15 minutes, and Sam playing his usual game, try to avoid some shots and just land a big left hand. But I don't know. I think we see Allen win minutes here. I don't think a finish is super likely, but like you said, if he somehow does get Alvey down, obviously he's going to have a big advantage there. But yeah, I think we see Allen. I think we see decision. I think there's better fights to target on DraftKings, but like you mentioned, yeah, I kind of like that goes to decision prop at plus money.
Yeah, I'm seeing what I can get down on it. A little bit over a unit, but not that much, honestly. So hopefully we don't get front run on that. Maybe we'll get involved, John. But the limits are still low on that as the market kind of begins to formulate. Not a ton of places that posted props for that fight. So shout out to FanDuel for doing so. But hopefully the market starts to expand a little bit, and that plus 148 hangs around for a little bit, and the listeners of the show don't go nab it before we do. But we got 3 fights left here for UFC Vegas 47. Let's move on to a fight where I saw you got involved with the underdog here. We got Shavkat Rakhmonov minus 235. His name has been like, it's not even that hard of a name to pronounce, but for whatever reason, it is like so difficult for me to say his name. Throughout all 3 of his UFC fights, I believe I'm 0 for 3 in pronouncing the name. Regardless, he's 2-0 in the UFC. He's minus 235. He's 9K. On DraftKings, Charleston Harris comes back. Plus 190 here is the dog. $7.2 thousand on DraftKings. John, saw you had to play on the dog, a multiple unit play on the dog, I should say. And I'm someone who's also intrigued in playing Harris in this spot. I missed the early numbers at plus 225, which I know you did too. I'm still tempted. I still think there's room to play Harris kind of at that plus 198 range currently on FanDuel, but I haven't pulled the trigger myself. I'm certainly tempted. You've got a pretty good chance to talk me into it, but I will give you the floor here and talk to me about what you see in Harris versus Rachmanov.
Yeah, I'm excited for this one. A, I think it's just going to be a good fight. Two guys with legitimate skill set, but also B, I think there's clear value on the underdog in Carlson Harris. And this is a guy who I think has been historically pretty underrated by the market. You know, obviously we had him, everybody had him in his, it seemed like everyone did against, who was it? Christian Aguilera, Christina's older brother. In his UFC debut, it was like I think a pick'em, I want to say somewhere around a pick'em, and that was just like everyone was smashing that, and he looked really good, and then came through in his last fight as well. Got the first round knockout. I think he was an underdog there too. I can't remember if I bet him there or if we just went heavy on DraftKings or what. But this is a guy who hasn't let us down yet, and honestly, like, even if he does let us down, I could still see this bet being value in the plus 200 range. Like against Rachmanov, I know he's a dangerous prospect, but I think he's kind of, you know, unproven a little bit. You know, obviously he has the submission skills. He's a finisher, never lost, but level of competition seems pretty decent. Obviously in UFC, you know, Cowboy Oliveira, that fight was kind of a stunt. You know, Oliveira was having success, and I think that's one thing that could be a factor here is that Rachmanov, we've seen him backed up. He doesn't deal super well with pressure, and really he just kind of, you know, it isn't a great minute winner in my opinion. Sort of relies on the finish, and now we have a guy in Carlson Harris who's more tested, who we know is going to bring the fight to him. Super high paced style fighter. You know, he wings crazy. Powerful overhand rights. Like he's kind of sloppy looking, but I mean, he gets the job done. He has power in his hands, fights at a high pace, and we know he's going to look to take the fight to the ground. Legitimate grappler as well. I think the grappling could be pretty even there. I actually think Harris might be a little bit better of a grappler, but I'm not super confident in that. But regardless, I would expect him to be the one landing takedowns here. And I don't even think he's a dog on the feet here. So I just think this is a fight where at worst, Harris looks like a small underdog, maybe like plus 140, something like that. And at best, we have a guy who's more capable of winning minutes and has just as much or close to finishing upside. So I like Harris as a dog. I played him for a unit and a half on FanDuel at plus 198. I'm going to be pretty heavy on this fight in general on DraftKings, but obviously going to have a decent amount of exposure to him as the underdog and the cheap price on DraftKings.
Yeah, I think you did it. I think you talked me into it. You know, I'm 1-1.
Boom, we got him.
I'm 1-1 on Carlson Harris. I believe you cashed on him against Impa Kasanganay. I bet the other side and lost because for whatever reason I was pretty high on Impa Kasanganay. Yeah. I still don't think he's like that bad, but he's obviously not in the UFC anymore. I'm just quickly looking up the odds here to see what's best available on Harris at current market. I see a plus 198. That's what you bet, right, John? Plus 198 over at FanDuel. Yeah, so plus 198 at FanDuel I think is the best out there currently. A bet I'll put in, I see a plus 200 on a local book. I'll obviously track it. Whatever's widely available at FanDuel, plus 198 seems to be the best price across the domestics currently. I think that's good enough for a bet. I probably won't go multi-unit. I'm not as confident as you are, John, that Carlson has like significant favorite upside in this matchup, but I expect him to just be competitive everywhere. And you mentioned it is not pretty. Like his overhand right is like it's almost funny watching it because it works though, and it seems like it works and is somewhat process driven. Like it doesn't look like he totally closes his eyes and throws. He just throws in a very like unique, unorthodox manner. Yeah, awkward is the perfect word for it. So I think that Harris is pretty competitive everywhere, and you just got to keep in mind like Shavkat, the win over Cowboy Oliveira like looks good. But at the same time, it wasn't a fight that like he downright dominated. And then Prazeres just got suspended for a second time and then retired because he's doing like horse tranquilizer. He's also like a foot and a half shorter than Shavkat. They look like in totally different weight classes there. So I haven't been like super, rah-rah, let's fade Shavkat right when he gets to the UFC. But it is a situation where I kind of feel like the market has gotten to a point where they're overrating him against a guy in Carlston Harris, who I bet in his UFC debut. I bet against him in his second fight. But I just think overall he's a solid fighter who's well-rounded enough to be competitive pretty much in every facet of the game here. So you talked me into it. I'll likely place a bet shortly after we get off the show, or at least track it. I may have bet it while you were talking. No comment there. But we've got 2 fights left. Let's move on to the co-main event here. We got Punahele Soriano as a minus 190 favorite. He's $8.6 thousand against Nick Maximov, who makes his second UFC appearance here. It's a plus 160 dog, 7.6K. And the game plan here for Maximov is going to be pretty obvious, John. He's looking to get takedowns early and often. That's what he did in Contender Series when he fought a guy who was basically 2 weight classes bigger than him. That's what he did against Cody Brundage in his UFC debut, where he landed, I think, 8 strikes at distance against Cody Brundage in that fight, but still won pretty easily, 29-28 across all 3 scorecards. He had almost 10 minutes of control time there, attempted 15 takedowns. Nick Maximov is a guy who he's going in there, he's shooting takedowns early and often. Punahele Soriano, on the other hand, is a guy who both of his UFC wins have come inside the first round via knockout. Certainly carries power in both of his hands, swings with pretty malicious intent, a guy who's looking for finishes early and often, has a bit of a wrestling background, out-wrestled Jamie Pickett offensively on Contender Series. Haven't really seen him get tested too much in terms of his defensive wrestling. He fought Brendan Allen his last fight out, lost a decision where Brendan Allen just kind of spammed body kicks at him, and Puna didn't have much of a response. I will say that Punahele Soriano, despite the fact that I have not been as high on him as others, and I am high on Brendan Allen, I thought he competed well in the 3rd round of that fight for a guy Soriano, who we thought had really bad cardio issues. He competed in round 3 against Brendan Allen. On my scorecard, I still scored it for Allen, but Puna had taken a lot of damage in that fight, continued to march forward, probably put together his best round of the fight later on. So that I thought were some encouraging signs for Punahele Soriano. I think the big question here is just Puna's takedown defense. It's relatively untested. And I think for Maximov, if he's going to win the fight, he's going to need probably between 8 and 10 minutes of control time. He's shown he has the cardio. He's shown he has the will to shoot 10, 15 takedowns and be able to wrestle consistently for the entirety of a 3-round fight. It just comes down to how good is Puna's takedown defense. You know what I mean? And I think that there's a decent chance that it's not as good as his offensive wrestling. Like, I think there's a decent chance that Maximov gets it down. You just have to think about, for Maximov to win, he basically needs to parlay 2 outcomes. A, he is terrible striking. He needs to not get knocked out on the feet. And then B, he also needs to be able to execute those takedowns in each round, maybe multiple times. So I think the path to victory is clear for Maximov. I actually think he's very capable of doing so. And I wouldn't be surprised if he puts Puna on his back. It just feels like the price is pretty accurate. Plus 160 for a guy to parlay both A, not getting absolutely decapitated when he's at a huge striking disadvantage, and B, getting the fight to the ground multiple times against a guy who's probably physically stronger than him and has a wrestling background in his own right. So for me, it's a pass. I kind of see the angle on Maximov a little bit, but most of what I've heard that the community seems like people think Puna's going to put this kid to sleep early, and I'm not sure. I disagree. So no action for me here in the co-main event. John, anything for you in Soriano versus Maximov?
This is a really fun matchup because I think the winner probably looks like hindsight big favorite here, because it really just comes down to who's going to be able to execute their game plan. And obviously you would think Soriano wants to keep the fight standing where he has a clear striking advantage. Obviously a knockout guy has like 5 of his 8 wins coming by knockout. I think all of them were inside the first round. I actually don't hate a knockout, first round knockout, maybe a small stab on that. I didn't look to see what it was, but maybe FanDuel's hanging a big number there. I might take a peek at that one. But yeah, I mean, Soriano, you mentioned it. He has a little bit of a wrestling background himself. It's just that nobody's really tested him to defend takedowns. So we really don't, just because we haven't seen it, it's tough to know how good his takedown defense is. I know UFC stats is like 100%, but I think he's only actually defended 1 takedown, I want to say, across
Brendan,
his 4 fights.
Well, Brendan Allen shot 1 takedown, and then no, I don't think anybody else has shot on him aside from that. Maybe Dusko shot it. I don't even think Dusko shot a takedown though, because he just got like absolutely obliterated. So I think it's only 1 takedown from Brendan Allen. Yep. And that wasn't like a desperate takedown. Like BA was beating him on the feet pretty easily. It wasn't I just rewatched the fight. It wasn't like he was like super intent on getting the fight to the ground. It was really working for the takedown. So it's a misleading stat. I agree with you.
Yeah. And that's the thing is, like, Maximov, we know he has a collegiate wrestling background. We know he's a dangerous grappler, a BJJ black belt. I think if he does get to fight to the mat, then he's capable of finishing himself. We also know that Soriano's gas tank is a little bit suspect. We saw that in the Brendan Allen fight. That was pretty clear. When that first round knockout doesn't materialize, now we can't just spam a heavy left hand. We have to actually do other things in the fight. But also, it's like Maximov's cardio is not that good. And I know it's kind of, it's tough to really know how good his cardio is, because it's like, okay, on a Contender Series, he was fighting somebody that was way heavier than him, like 60 pounds heavier, still took him down twice. Obviously, that's going to gas you out. But I just think his fighting style in general, he expends a lot of energy. And I think if Soriano is going to make him work for those takedowns, I don't know. It's just, it's really fun fight. Like I said in the beginning, like, I just think this is one where I think whoever wins, everyone's going to be like, oh, wow, that was like super dominant. That was the best bet of the card or whatever. So, but I'm kind of with you. I think Soriano probably keeps the fight standing or just nukes him early. I think Maximov has a good skill set, but I think he still needs a little bit of time to kind of put it all together. That's kind of where I stand. I know that's like, kind of a cop out, but yeah, we'll go with Soriano. I think this is another good fight to target. This is a fun slate on DraftKings. I think it's going to be high scoring.
Yeah, I agree that this is definitely a fight you want to target on DraftKings. I think either winner could get optimal pretty easily, even at either one of their price points. You're paying up a little bit for Puna, and Maximov is to the point where he doesn't have to finish, but like if he gets 3 to 5 takedowns and is one of the only dogs to win at 7.6K, he's gonna be pretty close to optimal. John, as you were talking, I looked up prices on Soriano to win by KO in round 1. See like plus 280 out there. Not as great as I would want. I don't think that's worth the bet. Personally.
That's terrible, actually.
Yeah,
I thought it was going to be like, more than plus 500. So yeah, that's not even close to playable.
The market has been getting a little bit stronger on FanDuel and DraftKings, at least with these like super binary fights where it's like Maximov's going to grind his way to a decision or Puna's going to take his head off. They're getting a little bit sharper in those markets, at least I found. So unfortunately, I don't think there's a great prop betting opportunity here in the co-main event, but sounds like either guy, in your opinion, could be pretty smash play on DraftKings. I'll have exposure to both sides as well. I think that's kind of the consensus opinion here. In the co-main, where we will not have a consensus opinion, I believe, is in the main event this weekend, where Sean Strickland is a minus 210 favorite. He's 8.8K on DraftKings. He takes on the Joker, Jack Hermansson, who's plus 175. 7.4K. We all know Sean Strickland is coming off of, or was coming off of, kind of a career-altering, potentially vehicle accident. He's since won, I think, 4 or 5 consecutive fights, up at 185 pounds after fighting at 170 for a long time. He gets a second consecutive main event spot here against Jack Hermansson, and I like Jack Hermansson in this spot. I bet him earlier today at plus 195 over at BetMGM. John, I know you may have some Sean Strickland love that you'll talk about here in a second when I see the floor to you, but look, I like Jack Hermansson here, and it's not that I don't like Sean Strickland as a fighter. You look at guys who I typically like to back in the betting market, it's not hard to see who they are. If you're a striker, you throw a ton of output, and if you're a wrestler, you go to wrestle early and often. And with Sean Strickland, his output is there, right? He's someone who lands over 5 strikes per minute. He absorbs a lot less strikes than he dishes out. He's someone who has a good strike differential, somebody who I'm just high on general. Thought he looked really good against Uriah Hall his last time out in a matchup that I expected him to win, but maybe not as dominantly as he did on the feet. The thing with Sean Strickland is this is a matchup that we haven't really seen him face in a long time. With Jack Hermansson, we kind of have this unique fighter at 185 pounds where his striking is decent, at least defensively. He's able to get out of the way. He measures distance pretty well. In the Marvin Vettori fight that won the entire 25 minutes of main event late in 2020, he lost the fight, but showed really good fight. I don't want to say really good fight in the fight, but showed a lot of heart in that matchup, was able to kind of compete with Marvin Vettori in a way that not a lot of guys have. He got him to the ground a couple of times, and, Vettori's pretty well versed on the ground, but Hermansson is one of those guys where he's not a great takedown artist. He's not a great wrestler. He does land about 2 takedowns per 15 minutes. So that's like a takedown every 7.5 minutes or every round and a half. So he does get fights to the ground, but where Jack really excels is when he gets on top. And that's where Sean Strickland is just relatively untested. And part of that is because he has decent takedown defense. And part of that is because his run at 185 pounds has been Nordine Taleb, Jack Marshman, Brendan Allen, who didn't shoot a single takedown and got his face absolutely boxed off in that matchup, Christoph Jocko, and then Uriah Hall, who has never shot a takedown in his life. So it's just one of those things where Strickland has shown decent takedown defense. Like, you go back and watch the Usman fight in 2017, he gets absolutely ragdolled in that fight, and then he bounces back. The Court McGee fight, He defended like 11 takedowns, but this is just a much better athlete than Court McGee, in my opinion, at least at this stage in their careers. And it's big at 185 pounds. And Sean Strickland is coming off of an injury where we haven't really seen him wrestle too much since the injury. It's not that I think Jack Hermansson should be favored in this fight necessarily, but John, you mentioned earlier when you were talking about the Carlston Harris fight, that's a guy who we think could look potentially like a pick'em and a couple iterations of his fight this weekend. In my opinion, Jack Hermansson's a plus 200 underdog who could easily look minus 200 at some point in this fight if he's able to get the fight to the ground in the first or second round and just get there consistently against Strickland. Like, there's definitely upside for Hermansson to look like a big favorite. And that's something that I'm trying to zero in a little bit more on, especially when I'm looking at big underdogs between high-level fighters. Like, I think we could all agree Strickland and Hermansson are high-level fighters, but I think it's a spot I missed in like the Giga Chikadze versus Calvin Kattar fight, where I didn't necessarily have a bet on Giga Chikadze, but I kind of assumed that, Kattar could get him to the ground, but I don't think I fully comprehended, like, if Calvin Kattar gets this fight to the ground in the first round and slows down Giga a little bit, he could easily look minus 200 from there on. And I don't think the cardio drop-off for Sean Strickland is going to be anything that close to drastic, but I think Hermansson can compete on the feet a little bit. I expect him to lose if they kickbox for 25 minutes, but man, he's seriously dangerous on top, and I think he's going to employ a game plan that's going to force Sean Strickland to at least prove to us that he's capable of being minus 200 against the guy who's going to shoot somewhere between 5 and 7 takedowns over the course of 25 minutes and push a pretty high pace throughout. So I laid my case there, played 195 just for a unit on Jack Hermansson. Like I said, I don't think he deserves to be the favorite or anything here, but I do think there's a lot of upside for a guy who's nearly a 2-1 underdog. But John, I know you got Sean Strickland closing out some parlays this weekend. Talk to me here about why you're on the Strickland side and maybe anything you disagreed with in my breakdown when I was back in Hermansson there.
Yeah, I'm definitely on the Sean Strickland side, have him closing out a parlay. I saw Luke in the chat said Hermansson's wrestling is good. So that's one thing I disagree with. I know you didn't say that, Jonah, but I think his wrestling is actually pretty poor. His takedowns are pretty poor, sloppy, doesn't set them up well, and doesn't have a ton of control either. And Strickland's a guy who historically has had really good takedown defense. I'm not convinced that Hermansson's going to be able to take him down. And I just think this is a spot where Hermansson has to land takedowns and then probably win by submission, unless we think he's just going to land takedowns every round and win rounds with top time, which I think is probably not happening here. And he's facing somebody that's never been submitted before, who's a pretty solid grappler himself. So I just think Sean's able to negate a lot of what Hermansson has to do to win this fight. And then in terms of the striking, it's not even close, in my opinion. I think Strickland's going to box him up. I think he's a much better striker. I think he's actually going to hurt Hermansson. Hermansson's durability is kind of suspect, in my opinion. We've seen him hurt multiple times. He's obviously been finished a few times as well. And I think Strickland has better cardio too. And I wasn't expecting that to be like a hot take this week, but I don't know. If it is, then whatever. I think Sean Strickland does have better cardio here. I think that's going to show itself in this matchup if he doesn't finish Hermansson earlier. I just think Sean Strickland's going to be able to keep the fight standing and win the striking. I mean, if Hermansson goes in there and takes him down every round and just like Habibs him, then I mean, hats off. I was dead wrong about it, but I really think Strickland probably knocks him out here, honestly, in like the 3rd or 4th round, or wins a convincing decision. I forgot to add the volume. The volume is like, if Hermansson does not get the wrestling going, there's a 0% chance he's going to be able to match the pace of Strickland striking. Landed almost 200 significant strikes against Uriah Hall. Hermansson, while he does have like decent pace early, like a lot of it is like just like he wastes so much energy bouncing around, twitching. Like he'll throw a lot of those leg kicks and stuff. But I think if the fight plays out for more than outside of the wrestling, if the fight plays out more than everyone thinks on the feet, I honestly kind of think it's a blowout. So I feel pretty good about the Strickland side. That's okay if I'm if I have to be on an island with my guy on Sean Strickland. But it's nice to disagree, especially on the main event, because it doesn't happen often. And 2022, new year, new us, because now it's going to be two cards in a row where we're button heads on the main event.
Yeah, exactly. 2 cards in a row. Last thing on the main event, just from a technical standpoint, is I think I give Jack a little more credit than you. I think you're right in his takedown defense, or his takedown entries are a little bit sloppy, but I think he's a lot more dangerous on top than you might be giving him credit for. Like, I don't think he has to win by submission. Like, he is some of the best. Like, if he gets Strickland mounted early, I mean, there's just not that much footage of Strickland on his back, and part of that is because he has good first level takedown defense, and he's shown that throughout his UFC career. But the other part of it is he just, especially at 185 pounds where guys are bigger and stronger, we haven't really seen him in those positions. Like, I honestly would not be surprised if like a Hermansson single leg turns into him being in full mount like 30 seconds later. And maybe I'm not giving Strickland enough credit for being like a well-rounded mixed martial artist, which I think he is. We saw Strickland go out and put on like an all-world performance against Uriah Hall. Just to me, I think that Jack Hermansson is capable of winning 3 rounds in this fight or getting a finish. So we're just going to have to agree to disagree here on the main event, John. And that is 2 in a row. Maybe next week we'll have another disagreement. I don't know who you've got in the title fight next weekend, but we'll get to that next weekend. John, if you have anything to add about the main event or anything we talked about, feel free to do so. And if not, take us on out of here.
Yeah, nothing else to add. I think it's going to be a fun card, like we talked about, high scoring slate on DraftKings. So don't be afraid to get a little out of the box, especially if you're playing the main tournament, the big tournament over there on DraftKings. But yeah, it should be fun, guys. Do me a favor, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and definitely join us next week for the big pay-per-view card. Going to be rolling out some new features. I'll just put it that way. Moving forward. So excited to unveil some of that stuff to you guys. But that's it for us. I'm John Kelly. That's Jonah Shiffman. This is the Undisputed MMA show presented by the FTN Network, saying goodbye and good luck. And we will see you guys next time.